Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week we're going to service and restore this Bianchi Sprint. This bike was on its knees when it arrived. Unrideable, in very sorry condition, but we are going to resurrect this bike and completely sort it out. New bearings right the way through, wheels, headset, bottom bracket, Freehub, new chain, new cables, tyres, tubes. We are really going to do the business on this. We're also going to clean and protect that paint to really bring it back. Initially, on our pre-checks, rear wheel, very buckled. So we know that we need to deal with this wheel, retension it and sort that out along the way. Chain, stretched right out, needs replacing, that's worn out. So even cleaning that wouldn't really be viable because it is stretched. So we need to replace that. We're going to pick a lovely chain for this bike that will really lift that drivetrain. So off comes the chain, and at this stage now I'm going to be stripping the bike down, ready for the service and restoration. So I've weighed up what parts I need and how involved this work is going to be. So we will take off all the drivetrain, all the components, really bring this bike back to the frame, and then we will go right the way through. So off comes the rear derailleur. This actually threw us up a little bit of a curveball. Note the rivets there on the jockey wheels. We weren't able to take the cages apart on this derailleur, but we'll sort that out anyway. Very rusty fittings here, steel bolts that rusted completely away. So we'll clean up that bottle cage because it is of the era of the bike, and we will also replace those bolts with nice fresh ones to make this really stand out. And then we're going to also remove front derailleur, chain set, and really get everything there serviced, lubricated and cleaned up. You can see here how this does need cleaning. We will clean this component, re-lubricate it, refit it back on the bike. Off come the pedals. These were in a sorry state really, but we also did the bearings in the pedals and really sorted those out as well. Again, it was all things on the bike that were where it had been standing were deteriorated that we needed to clean up, re-lubricate, and obviously fresh bearings, and it just transforms the bike. Well, you wouldn't have been out to ride it as it was, but would transform the ride and make it feel $1 million. So off comes the chain set. Obviously we have to extract that off because we are going to remove the bottom bracket. We're also going to clean this up. I quite like this chain set. I'll explain that as we go. There was something a little bit unusual about it that I quite enjoyed. That was quite a pleasure to see this one and to actually deal with it. It was a first. There are a few firsts on this bike for me, things that I hadn't quite seen the same as on this bike before. And that is the pleasure of doing these older bikes. They're not your day-to-day work, so they're of an era before my time in the industry, so I'm always seeing things on them that are new to me, and it's why they're such a pleasure for me to do them. Off comes the bottom bracket bearing, so we'll just extract that out. Now the bearings in this were very dry and sticky. You can see here on the drive side on the left of your screen there how they had started to get that rusty look about them where water had ingressed in there, caused the bearings and the cages to go rusty. So we will replace all those bearings and clean everything up, and it will be absolutely spot on when it goes out. Now I extract the drive side cup there. Note that's a standard right-handed thread, so extracts anti-clockwise. Obviously on European bottom brackets that would be a left-handed thread, but in the case of the Italian thread it's a standard thread size. So we now take off the rear brake as well. I am actually removing the brake pads at this stage. I'm going to replace those. With this service, I'm replacing all the serviceable components and things that would be a safety issue. So brake pads, they dry out, they go very hard, the rubber, especially if the bike's been sitting for many years, which this bike has. So we'll replace those brake pads and all the cables. All the cables on this bike were frayed off, and we'll show you something there with the cables that we're going to be putting back on this bike when we do that. That is quite specific to our cabling and makes for a very nice shift and braking actuation. So both front and rear brakes come off. We've got those lovely mud guards, those little short mud guards that we're going to clean up, and you can see here how the brake itself is very grimy. It's going to need a clean up through the ultrasonic cleaner, but we'll do that, and then we'll also re-lubricate that because there are moving parts even in your brake caliper that do need servicing. Off come those shifter cables now, and the shifters will take off the frame, and then we will remove the brake cables from the hoods themselves. I had to be very careful with these hoods The rubber around the hood was quite perished. They are known for splitting and cracking and deteriorating. We didn't want to affect that in any way, so I was very cautious to take this apart and rebuild it without actually removing the hood rubbers. But I do give those a clean down, and it all worked out very, very well. So they come off the handlebars there. And now I'm going to turn that quill and remove those handlebars off of the frame as well, because we are going to be doing the headset bearings. Now this saddle, it gave us a little bit of a dilemma. We actually brought a new saddle to replace that one because it was damaged, but that one had the Bianchi logo on it, and we didn't really want to lose that original part off the bike, so we actually refitted it even though it was damaged, which you'll see further down. We did clean it up. I actually put all the components in the ultrasonic cleaner, including that chain set, but that was actually a painted component. That wasn't aluminium, that's actually painted. So we're going to clean off the grease and everything that's on it in the ultrasonic cleaner. There you can see that lifting away all the dirt and debris off of these components that we've put in, and then we're going to clean those down and actually polish them, which you'll see shortly. So this is the brake caliper now. All of these parts are being washed off, so what we're doing here is washing off the degreaser that we've used. So I'll wash these off, dry them down with a microfiber towel, blow them out with an airline if needed, and that will make sure that none of that degreaser is left on the component. Once we've done that, I'm also going to wash down the hoods. These didn't go through the degreaser. This is just a soapy water wash that we're using on those, because again, we didn't want to risk anything with the rubber on those hoods. And also these little mini mud guards, they're actually chromed plastic, so we just wash those down as well. Now, as mentioned, the chain rings themselves are actually painted, so we're going to use our auto glim resin polish to take that tardiness off them and really bring those up. The grease had impregnated that paint a little bit, so we buffed that off, and the polish will also protect it slightly moving forwards. Now this is what I mentioned with this chain set, how that central spider is actually cast in a way that it also has a chain guard on it, and the bolt holes all set in that casting. Very unusual, not seen it before, but what a lovely piece that is. And also I'm now auto glimming the mud guards themselves to protect those and to really bring them up. And you'll see with this front derailleur, when I buff this off now, the reflection that that gives on the aluminium and chromed part makes a huge difference. Now this rear derailleur, we couldn't take it apart. The caging itself was riveted. There were a lot of plastic parts on this derailleur, so this really was a sacrificial wear it out, throw it away and replace it with a new one. It's not worn out, so we're going to degrease it with a spray degreaser rather than putting it in the ultrasonic cleaner, so it's a little bit less harsh, but we can now wash it off in a similar fashion as the other components. Just be mindful of the fact we don't want to flush everything out in the way of lubricating, especially in those jockey wheels, but now we can lubricate what we can get to as per normal. So we're using our premium grease there on the spring. We're actually using general purpose oil there on the jockey wheels. We're going to spin that in to help lubricate those and then lubricate the pivot points of the derailleur itself. So once that's done, it actuated and worked absolutely perfectly, so there was no need to replace it at this stage. It had plenty of life left in it, and we were quite happy with that component. Same with this front derailleur. It's part of the same group set, so it's definitely the original one for the bike and the original one that would have come with that rear derailleur, and we just lubricate that up in the same fashion. Popping on new brake pads here. This is something that I tend to always do with this type of restoration on these kind of brakes, because the old rubbers do go hard, so we're having fresh pads there, so that's nice. Also lubricating the thumb adjuster, so I'm using general purpose grease there on the thumb adjuster. This is what we use to adjust the brake moving forwards as it wears, and then I'm also just lubricating the pivot point there on the brake caliper itself. And I'm also using our silicone grease here on the slider of the spring itself. That will just help that slide up and down as it's actuating, and it's often a little lubrication that's rarely done and often missed. Now your skewers also have moving parts in them. The handle that you pull for the lever, that moves and actuates inside the skewer itself. So I'm going to lubricate along the shaft. That will stop it sticking in the wheel and binding. They can often rust within a wheel, so it's always important to lubricate your skewers as well. Now I'm turning my attention to the chain set. I'm using a thread locker there where the bolts will actually sit through. There's no bolts on the back of these, so you can see they spin in nicely. Thread locker will stop them coming undone. That will hold all the chain rings in there correct position without any risk of anything failing in the future. And I'm also going to torque those up at the same time to make sure they are absolutely spot on and ready to go back on the bike. And that was, to me, a lovely chain set. I enjoyed working on that one just because of the slight different design. Now I'm going to turn my attention to the pedals. I always feel pedals and Freehubs and things of that nature are often the part of restorations when people say they're restored a bike on amateur restorations that are often neglected or missed as part of that service. So people will often do bottom bracket bearings, headset bearings. They often don't consider the fact that the pedals also have bearings in them, and they're often missed. And they are quite a fiddle, but once you've done a few sets, you do get used to doing them. So initially, I'm stripping everything off of this pedal so that I can strip it right down and clean the parts. So we're going to take the cap off the end of the pedal now. That comes off and reveals all the bearings and pre-tensioners and everything for the bearings inside the pedal itself. So that's the lock nut for that, and then there's this little washer here that we have to remove. That was actually quite deep in, so a little bit fiddly to remove, but with a magnet there I was able to extract that. And then this is the cup and cone bearing system that these have in them. So we can now lift that away, and then once I've lifted that away I can remove the bearings just using a little magnet there. Helps remove them out of the body. Now I can degrease even the pedal components here. So a few little components, they've all gone through the ultrasonic cleaner, being degreased, so that works right in deep where I can't necessarily get with a brush. Really cleans those components off. Now I wash them down. I mean, look at that axle there. That's come up like a new piece, so very pleasing. Washed off the reflectors as well, although those hadn't been through the ultrasonic cleaner, so you have to sort of pick your battles with the ultrasonic cleaner. You want to really get the greasy components cleaned, but it's not necessary to do every single component. Some actually benefit just from being washed down so that you don't damage them. New bearings in there, you can see I'm using our premium grease there. That's a nice grease that will actually hold the bearings against gravity. They actually help you while you're working on the component. There's bearings on both sides of that race there, and they stay where they are as I put it together. In goes that cone and cup there, and then I can actually put the washer and the lock nut on once I know that the pre-tension is correct. So in goes the little washer, on goes the lock nut. Everything there is now absolutely as it needs to be, with brand new bearings, brand new grease, nice serviceable pedal, ready to go many more miles. And then we just lock that cap off. So we can just pop the toe guards back on this one and the reflectors, trying to keep it all original. The toe guards were a little bit tired on this bike, but certain components, they just look nicer on the bike, being the ones that came off the bike. You can sort of over restore a bike sometimes, and I personally think that this is the best route for this kind of restoration, to try and reuse all the components that are on the bike. So we're now going to pop the strap. We've actually cleaned that as well, you would have seen. So that's now nice and clean. It takes the grayness of the dirt off it, so that's now absolutely ready to go back on. Turning my attention now to the headset bearings. So I'll remove the forks off of the bike, clean everything up the same, similar processes to everything else, and then we'll pop new bearings. But look how these sort of stick to the frame as I lift them. The grease is very thick and it's gone sticky, and it goes almost like treacle. It goes very sticky, very thick. That doesn't help for smooth steering on the bike or smoothness of the bearings themselves. So that's a sign of a bike that stood for a long while when the grease thickens up like this, or a bike that hasn't been serviced in decades. So I'm going to clean off the grease off of those, and then I'll wipe them down, and we'll put fresh grease, fresh bearings, and everything on the steering will be absolutely spot on. The cups and the cones on this bike were all in good condition. You can see there's no marking on there, no pitting. It absolutely worked perfectly once rebuilt. Now I'm using loose balls here. I could have put the cages back. I could have even cleaned the bearings that were there. I like to replace everything with loose ball bearings. It's just something that's my personal preference, especially on headsets. They can get little grooves on the outer, and that will enable the bearings to sit in those grooves, and it can make a little bit of a notchy steering, especially if there's a bit of wear in there. But when you put loose ball bearings in like this, it helps support the bearings a little bit more, and I find you just get a little bit more life out of them when you put loose ball bearings in. And again, that's just a habit thing and a little bit of skill, and experience in fitting those without them all falling out on you as you're doing it, and it's just my preferred method. Now we're going to wash this lovely Celeste green, blue, what is it, green or blue? Put that in the comment below. What do you think? Is it a green or is it a blue? We're going to wash this bike off. We're using our big softy brush here. This is a nice soft bristled brush that will help lift off the dirt without damaging the frame in any way. And once I've washed it down initially like this, I will then use a microfiber towel to dry it back off. That is a very absorbent material, the microfiber, that really lifts off that wetness and leaves the frame absolutely dry as it needs to be. And now I'm using the Autoglim Super Resin Polish. This is a lovely soft creamy polish that lifts away the impregnation of dirt that you get on a frame. You can feel the frame changing under your fingers. It goes from sort of a sandy rough feel to a high polished smooth easy feel on the fingers, and it makes the bike lovely and water resistant, nice and shiny again, draws all that debris off. And once I've buffed this off, you can see here again, fresh microfiber towel. So I buff that new polish off and it really gives that depth of shine. And then my final task is to spray it with the rapid ceramic spray. This will protect all that polish and all that frame with a lovely waterproof coating, and the water will absolutely sit on this ceramic spray and will just run off the bike. It's a lovely finish, especially on something of vintage nature like this. It really can make that paint last so much longer. Now, my favorite part of the whole restoration, it's not something you can always do, but is to service this Freehub. Freehubs in general are generally designed really to be a throwaway component. You wear them out, you spin off the old one, spin on a new one, and away you go. But with a 5-speed block like this, it's so original to the bike that my preferred method is to service them. But it takes a little bit of practice to get them right. Recently we did a bike and actually we couldn't even get the Freehub apart, so we replaced it. But in general, I always try to service this component. So you can see I've already removed the cogs, and now I've just got to undo the central lock. That's a left-handed thread, so we remove that, and then you can see the bearings revealing themselves there. So we'll use a magnet to take those out. And actually on this bike, they were very dry. You can see there's no grease running on them. Although they weren't rusty, wouldn't have been long before they would have gone rusty. So we've removed the bearings, and now we can remove the pores and give this hub itself a nice clean up. So a couple of little spaces there to remove, a little retaining spring there, and then there's actually only 2 pores on this bike, so they both come out, and that now means we're ready to do the cleaning on this. So again, we turn our attention to the ultrasonic cleaner, in go those components including the cogs, everything in there, run that through, and then we can wash them down. Now you can see here they're washing down quite nicely, all the grease is off. We then wipe those down with a microfiber towel, and in most cases that would be absolutely perfect. We could rebuild this hub and everything there would be nice and clean, but we're going to go the extra mile with this one, and what we actually plan to do is to polish those cogs to really make that Freehub really nice when it goes back on the bike. And now we're going to use our polishing wheel to just polish the surface of these cogs. They had a very nice finish on them, so this just takes off that in-ground debris that has sat there for years and the chain has worked into the metal. We can polish that metal up, and it really popped out when we finished. So let's get that back together now. So we're using the Shimano Freehub grease on the pores themselves, and then once they are refitted, a little bit fiddly, but they pop into their little slots, and then we can work on the bearings and the various greases that we need to make this absolutely perfect. So that's the little retaining spring there. Everything there is now good. So I'm going to use a little bit of our anti-seize grease on the threads initially. That's where the lock ring goes on. Then I'm using our premium grease here where the bearings are going to sit. So we'll first of all replace this bottom row of bearings. So we just work those round with a set of tweezers, taking our time, placing all the bearings nicely. And then once that row is complete, we can now put a second layer of grease just over the top of those. Again, that will just help them against gravity, help them settle in when we put the top back on the hub. And then we have a second row of bearings here, so I'm going to put a little bit of the Freehub grease where the pawls ratchet, and then I'm going to put a little bit of premium grease around the race itself, ready for the second row of bearings. There are actually a few less bearings in this top row than the bottom row. Once they're in, again, second row of grease just to help those all stay where they need to stay, and then we can slot this back together. So we'll do this in the vise to hold everything nice and square, so there's no risk of me slipping or moving. That goes in nicely, and then we can put the lock ring on. Now the lock ring I also polished, we didn't show that, but you can see how shiny that now is. So when we put the cogs back on there, it's going to look really nice from the center. Before we do that though, we're going to replace the wheel bearings out of this wheel, begin to clean this up. So take the axle out, take the bearings out, and again you can see there how it's gone very treacly, the grease. So these were long overdue, fresh bearings and fresh grease. So out come the bearings, again using a magnet, just makes it a little bit easier for me. Remove those covers and we can get everything there again in the ultrasonic cleaner. So with this bike, certainly the ultrasonic cleaner was much needed, and once again that's been through, we can just wash these components down. So that's the covers there and the axle all washed down. We'll dry those out, and then we will start to clean this hub from the center of the wheel. Now with this wheel at this stage, I could already feel there are a few spokes loose. We did have the wheel that was buckled when the bike arrived, but once we clean this off, we will then sort that out. So cleaning the hub first, that was an amazing transformation. I just used the wire wool and the wire brush to break down all the thick greases there. And then I'm going to wash the spokes down, and I'm using wire wool, and you can see a few of them there moving. The whole wheel was very, very lowly tensioned. I have a feeling in the past this wheel's been rebuilt. I think the tensions that were on it were so low. I just feel that probably this has been rebuilt at some point and the tensions weren't quite right. The spokes have released themselves, which is why the wheel was then not running square, and it just needed that extra of getting the wheel retensioned, which we will then deal with. And this is what I'm looking for when I'm washing down a wheel of this nature and a hub of this nature, is to find the little problems that maybe have been missed in the past to really make the bike absolutely perfect moving forwards or riding forwards. So you can see we've put the new bearings in the axle there, the cup and cone system there adjusted, and then we can put the lock nut on and make sure that the bearings are absolutely spot on. Once again, you can see the amazing depth of shine and the colour back in that wheel. We can then put the hub back on. So I'm using a little bit of our anti-seize grease here on the threads for the Freehub. That will help me if ever I need to resurface it to get it apart. So we can torque that up, same as we would with a cassette, but in this instance the Freehub. And then I'm using a little bit of our general purpose grease on the hub itself, similar to OA I would with a cassette, to put the cogs back on one by one, but that will again stop them sticking to that in the future with rust or any problems. Again, our anti-seize grease on the final lock-in ring that goes on there. On goes those, spin that one on, and we don't need two chain whips for this, we just need one because it's going against the hub itself. Tighten that up and you can see how beautiful that looked. Now before I retension the wheel, I'm going to change the tyre in the tube and inflate the wheel. That will make sure that any tension movement from the wheel inflating is not going to happen when I retension the wheel. So I'm also going to replace the inner tube because they do deteriorate, and the fact there was a lot of rubber deterioration on this bike with like the tyre being deteriorated and the hoods being deteriorated, it was prudent to replace the tyre and the tube on this instance on this bike. So got brand new tyre going on there with a lovely tan wall, and then a new inner tube into the wheel, and that will settle that nicely and obviously give us plenty of miles of safe riding with a good tyre. That tyre there was actually a retro Michelin one. It has the big logo which really suited the bike. I think it really added to the look, especially compared to a modern brand. So we inflate this, and once it's inflated we can put a new valve cap on. Now you can see here on this graph how low the tensions were on this bike. It was all over the place, this rear wheel. So we go right the way around, drive side, non-drive side, making sure that the tensions are even both left and right of the wheel. until it's absolutely where it needs to be a safe wheel. You can see there visually how bad it was when it came in, and then on the next graph you can see a visual representation of how nice we got this wheel, which is absolutely spot on, and I was very pleased with the way that came up. Next up, I'm going to do the bottom bracket bearing. So using our premium grease there, brand new ball bearings into that one, and that can then be refitted. Again, second row, it's just a good way of holding this against the gravity and enabling it to go back in the bike without any movement. And I'm also using our anti-seize grease here on the threads of the bottom bracket, so that next time we need to service this, it won't be bound into the frame, and it should be relatively straightforward to remove this cup for the next service. Both sides, fresh grease, work that in, and then we can put the cup and axle back in. So obviously axle in first, cup in second, and then there's the little lock ring that goes over the top of that one. And you can see the reflection there, how nice these components have come up. I'm going to turn my attention now to the handlebars, which had a really strange old angle on these when the bike arrived. I wouldn't normally change these angles and things, but I took a bit of artistic license and actually put this back to where it really should be for riding. I'm not quite sure why it was ever at that angle. It could have been that they were actually loose in the centre at some point and they've actually moved. Who knows the history of why they were at such a strange angle, but we're going to put those right. So they go back on the bike, and then I'm going to actually change that angle just to bring that back up to a more pleasant looking angle. Next up, the hoods go back on. Once that's on, I will actually torque those up on the bike before I do anything else. Once the cable is in, you can't get to that bolt, so torque it up now. And then we can put the chain set on. That lovely chain set, tightened up, and then once it's on, torqued up. I like to torque these up before I put the front derailleur on, because the front derailleur moves left and right, non-drive side to drive side. And I do like to make sure that a chain set is torqued and tight so that there's no chance of, when I do torque it, pulling it in any further, which would alter the adjustment of the front derailleur if that did happen. So we need to make sure that's absolutely spot on. And what a lovely spin this now has with those fresh bearings, worlds apart from when it came in, and lovely bottom bracket. And that is the beauty of these lovely old steel bikes. The bearings on them are so nice. On goes the pedals now, so we can tighten those up. So that's the drive side pedal on, all nice, new bearings, everything right. And on goes the non-drive side pedal now. So we're using a little bit of our anti-seize grease in the threads of that as well. Tighten that one up, and that's the pedals back on along with that lovely chain set. And then we can start to think about the drivetrain now. So on goes the front derailleur. The paint and components look absolutely amazing here, much better than I expected, which is always nice. Then on goes the rear derailleur. This was actually the first derailleur I'd ever seen like that, where you couldn't remove the jockey wheels. So again, a couple of little firsts on this bike, which is always nice really. On goes the shifters, and then we can start to put the brakes on. So we've got those lovely little mud guards there, which are very period. You do occasionally see them on these old bikes, but you don't see them on modern bikes for some reason. No modern bike would have a tail mud guard like that, so they go back on the bike. And now we clean up this Bianchi saddle. This is the original saddle to the bike, and it seems such a shame that it had that little mark in the front edge. As I mentioned, we did buy a new saddle for this bike, but I couldn't bring myself to fit it. With this lovely logo on there, so original to the bike, and that's maybe for the next rider or owner to decide on what they want to do with that saddle. For the time being, it's got the original one back on there. On went the bottle cage there, all the rust cleaned off and new bolts, so that doesn't show that rustiness that it had before. And now we're re-cabling the bike. So initially we're going to put the derailleur cables on. These are our lovely stainless steel super slick cables, which I shall talk about shortly with the brakes. So now I'm threading the cables through the frame and then into the front derailleur first. There's no adjustments here as it's a friction shifter, and then cut the end of the front cable off nice and short so that it doesn't foul the chain set. When you start to put these on, I always get a sense of satisfaction. I feel like I'm bringing the bike alive again when I start to recable it. It's lovely to see things starting to move again and do what they're supposed to do. It's always a pleasing part for me. Now I want these tails to be the same length on the brakes and the derailleur there, so I use a little cable guide there before nipping the end on, and I'll reuse that in the brakes. Now I wanted to show you this. This is our super slick cables. You can see here the original cable was 1.79 millimeters thick. It's a nice cable. Our super slick cables are stainless steel and they're wound tighter. So you can see they're 1.45. It's not that there's less cable in there, it's that they're wound much tighter. So they've got the same strength, but they run and actuate so much nicer. It's the same with our gear cables. They usually work out thinner than the original because it's spun and wound tighter. It's also much smoother through the fingers. So if you was to drag a cable through your fingers, the original one would have felt rough, where the new ones feel smooth. They are a lovely cable. All these are available on our website, along with a lot of the other components that we use on our restorations. So things like the chains and the handlebar tapes and the greases and the lubricants and cleaners and all these various things we do sell on our website. And we're adding stuff on there quite regularly as well as we're expanding and the videos move on, and we may use things that we think would be useful to you, so we put those on the website. So it's always worth checking back at the website as well if you've already visited it once. We're always adding things on there. We start to add a few park tools now. We're going to add this bar tape to the website as well, because this is a lovely tan bar tape we really felt worked with this bike, and we've actually put that on the website too. So please do check that out. The link's always in the description below, and it's a way also of helping the channel. We've popped that lovely retro looking bar tape on here now, and we felt it matched the hoods and the style of the bike, so we're just trimming that off, making sure that all the finishing of that is at the bottom of the handlebars, so that as a rider you never see that from the top looking down, that everything is finished underneath at the bottom. So we nip that off and that goes round to the bottom of the handlebars. Next up, we're going to pop the wheels on. So front wheel, rear wheel, and you can already begin to see that hub there. On goes this lovely silver chain. I like these on restorations because when you've got the chrome and the alloy and everything shiny, often on 5, 6, 7 speed, the chain really lets the restoration down, because most of them that shops sell tend to be the cheaper versions of chains, and this isn't that. It's a lovely finish on these chains and really works nicely. So I'm checking the gears are all working. I've done my adjustments on those and everything there is working perfectly up and down. Check the brakes are working. They're absolutely fine, and that also when they release then they're not rubbing on the wheel, so I'm checking that as well. And then the final thing for me to do is to torque this bike up. There's not an awful lot. I tend to only torque up anything with an Allen head. It's done with a torque wrench. The rest on these old bikes mostly is done by feel, so any of the nuts and bolts I tend to do by feel rather than a torque setting, but anything with an Allen head will be torqued up. So you can see here from these before and afters a huge difference we've made to this bike. Now if that's not worth a subscribe, I don't know what is. So please do subscribe, do drop us a like, and I do hope you've enjoyed this video. You can see what a massive difference we've made to this. It's the subtleties that really lift a restoration like this. We try to keep everything original as best possible, with the exception of the serviceable items, which are all fully serviced, and you can see it's just worlds apart from when it came in. Everything about it is so beautiful, and we thoroughly enjoyed doing this one. I hope you've enjoyed this video too. So nothing more for me to say but to say we'll see you again very soon. Bye for now.